Welcome to Charlotte Readers Podcast, where authors give voice to the written words. I'm Landis Wade, host of the show, and as you can tell, we're not in the podcast studio today. We're at Park Road Books, sponsor of the show, and I'm here with Cathy Pickens, an author who appears in Season 2 of the podcast. Cathy, welcome.
Thank you, Landis.
Now, Cathy, you have been writing mystery novels for years, but now you're turning into kind of a true crime aficionado, right?
I am.
Why the switch, and what attracts you to that kind of
that's
writing?
an interesting question. I grew up loving mystery, so when I started writing them for St. Martin's, I said, well, I need to know everything I can possibly find out about how crime really works. So I immersed myself in the research, and in that found these fascinating stories. Then I ended up meeting and working with inmates. And now all of a sudden, mystery isn't just an intellectual puzzle in an Agatha Christie novel, and it's full of very rich, funny, heartbreaking, hopeful stories. What's better for a writer?
Well, speaking of heartbreaking stories, I'm not sure hopeful will fit into this analysis, but on the podcast, you read a number of true crime stories about Charlotte involving murdered bankers, swindling evangelist, the Loomis Fargo heist, a serial killer, and even Razor Girl.
Razor Girl.
Let's read about Razor Girl.
Razor Girl is my favorite. Actually, this story, I'm working on a book now, and Woman at the Library is the one who pulled this out of the archives 10 years ago. I didn't know that. I found it in another way. I first learned of Razor Girl's 1926 case visiting a Charlotte-Mecklenburg police exhibit at the Charlotte Museum of History in 2010. No historical crime review of a southern city can overlook a case that so neatly highlighted the privilege of being a murderess in an older South, at least if you were small and funny and knew how to flirt. True, her 23-year-old bigamist husband, Alton Freeman, was, as we say, no better than he ought to be. A convicted thief, he'd been running around on her, living off her $15 a week factory wages. One night, he told 19-year-old Nellie he was leaving her as soon as he pulled off a whiskey heist. Nellie calmly told the officer who later arrived at their little house that she had hugged him around the neck, asking if he didn't love her. He didn't. She didn't know how sharp the knife was, she said, until he lay on the floor, only a bit of flesh and bone holding his head to his body. Nellie wasn't shy about talking to police and to newspapers. She attracted the best lawyers in town to her defense team. Until then, Charlotte juries had a habit of acquitting women of murder, and prosecutor and former mayor Frank McNinch vowed he'd see the end of women getting away with murder. The battle was set. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. Women in particular flocked to see the spectacle. After all, a woman couldn't be sent to prison, could she? That wasn't the done thing. On the courthouse steps, the only thing missing was a cotton candy vendor. But someone was selling replica straight razor pens to commemorate the event. The jury deliberated for 2 days, read some Bible verses on forgiveness, talked the manslaughter holdouts around, and found Nellie Freeman not guilty by reason of insanity. It not being unheard of that a woman could be struck crazy for a short period of time, long enough to kill a lying, cheating husband. The judge allowed her to take her bloody dress and razor with her, and she seems to have vanished from Charlotte. Now, that's what I wrote, but as it turned out, she went to Kentucky, married, came back to Charlotte, lived just north of uptown for 40 years, happily married, raised her family, and died at Mercy Hospital in 1964.
Well, what I love about that is it's not just a newspaper account of what happened. I mean, you weave in some storytelling there, and it's fun.
It's a story.
Yeah, it's a story. And Razor Girl is a story. So it's too bad you didn't get a chance to interview Razor Girl.
That would have been good. That would have been good.
So, Cathy, in writing true crime, what do you find more fascinating? The ones they catch or the ones they didn't?
That's an interesting question. I think for me that even sometimes when they catch them, the story is unsatisfying. That there's that little bit more you want to round it out. It's not fiction. You can't make it the way you want it to be. But there's always this multifaceted story to look at, because bad guys aren't all bad. And the good guys aren't all good. And there's a certain humanity even in those folks who've done things that we can't imagine doing ourselves, and that little tiny fear that we might be capable of that ourselves.
Now, you write about Jim and Tammy, and Jim made a comeback, right?
Yes,
he's
he did.
back selling
Yes,
generators to people that
Waiting for the end times.
yeah. And you wrote about Loomis Fargo heist,
did.
right? You know,
I did.
that masterminded theft.
Yes. And of course it's a movie,
Right.
Masterminds movie. They're, I think, all out of jail now and living
So,
their lives.
are we safer now than we were before, or in Charlotte?
From them or just in
In
general?
general, yeah. Well, from them we are safe. Yeah.
And in 1966, it would have been 1939. There was a Charlotte News editorial where the editor-writer just got all incensed because J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had overlooked Charlotte and had failed to name it the murder capital of the country, which in fact it was. And it was like 10
It's a nice
times
thing to
more
be
than
proud
Chicago.
of,
Yeah,
yeah.
and they were really incensed that they had been overlooked. And I think today we might, I don't know if we'd have a different point of view today or not. We don't like to be overlooked.
Well, I hope we're not doing anything criminal with the podcast.
I hope not.
What do you think of the podcast? Yeah.
As a reader, you have opened this door for me to writers I didn't know, but I think even more telling to writers I thought I did know, both their books and them personally. I've learned things I didn't know about. It's just been such a neat way. You draw out of them these stories that even for those who are my friends, I didn't know.
That's why we make them sign a release.
For whatever soul bearing they may do.
That's right, yeah. Well, thanks for coming on here
Thank
and
you.
for being on the show.
It's been great fun.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today. Another fine author giving voice to her written words. If you'd like to listen to Cathy talk about and read about true crime, you can do so by going to Charlotte Readers Podcast on Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to get your podcasts, or at our website, charlottereaderspodcast.com. Until the next episode, I'm Landis Wade for Charlotte Readers Podcast.